the common thread is lack of clarity and lack of a plan, right? If we can develop a plan that is a North Star of where do we need to be going, where do we want to go, why do we want to be going there, and then to bring the plan around it quantitatively and qualitatively to support it, it helps us course correct, if you will, to actually put some meat on the bone to what does on track mean? What does on track mean to me, to us, to our financial plan, our family, our household? And then let's develop the plan and execute on that plan over a long period of time. Tim, today we're going to talk about the concept of being on track. And as the name implies, there's some type of measuring stick that we're comparing that against, whether it's us as an individual asking, am I on track? Or for those that are working with an advisor, it could be that individual is helping them assess, hey, are you on track financially? And so I want to unpack that term as we get started here. When someone says, hey, I think I'm on track, or I think I'm behind, what are they actually trying to measure? Or what do you think they're trying to measure? Is it a retirement number? Is it something more related emotionally, a peace of mind, or having options or flexibility? Like, what do you think is packed inside of that term?
That's actually a great question, Tim. I don't think it's a retirement number. I think if I think about the pharmacist brain, I think it is more about, am I checking all the boxes that need to be checked? I think it's more like that. And then I think you do overlay a bit of the, where do I fit in the space financially relative to peers, right? And again, I think anytime that you compare, that's a bit of an issue, because everybody's financial plan is a unique snowflake. Everyone's circumstance is different. So I do think it's more about, am I taking advantage and doing all the things that I should be doing? And most of the time we just don't know, right? Because we're not financial planners. We read things, or we hear what our colleagues are doing with real estate or crypto, and they're like, okay, maybe I should be doing that. Or, I see a colleague that retires and I'm like, man, I feel like I'm far away from that. But then I do think it is, again, thinking about the pharmacist brain, I do think it is also like a numbers based.
Yeah.
And it's probably more related to like investment portfolio and savings, and less about what we think is most important, or it could even be income, and probably what we think is less important or most important, which would be kind of net worth and, overlaying expected net worth there. So it is a question that I often ask, and it's purpose, like a prospective client, it is purposely meant to be open-ended, to kind of delve into where, what do you mean by that? And I think oftentimes a default answer I get is like, well, I just don't feel like I have enough set aside. Right. But I do think at the end of the day, it's also like, where do I fit? Like if I'm a 45-year-old pharmacist, like where do I fit with other 45-year-old pharmacists? And I think that's a good thing to kind of know that as a benchmark, but it also can be a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. As you were sharing that, I was thinking about my own journey, and we'll talk a little bit about how this might shift, right, over time or in different stages of life or career, how this definition could and probably will look differently. But, I was thinking about early in my journey, coming out $200,000 of debt, right? The on track that for me was, am I progressing and paying off this debt? Am I on track with what my peers are doing, or, how fast I should pay off this debt? Or could have been a home purchase. Am I on track with buying a home and getting out of a renting, situation, because that's just maybe what you're supposed to do. But I think as time progresses, and I would echo what you said in the conversations I have with pharmacists where this topic comes up, it typically is quantitatively focused and specifically around income, and or retirement balance, investment balance, right? There's some type of number they have in mind that is where they should be. And it usually is centered around those two pieces. And it's often then, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but it's often then when we start to talk about the broader parts of the plan of, hey, well, what about the other things in addition to income or investments? Which of course, income is going to be the tool that we use for so many parts of the plan. But what about the wealth protection side of the plan, right? When we talk about estate planning or insurance, or even on the qualitative side, let's talk about that part of the equation, like we have been doing on this show the last couple episodes as well. So it does feel very quantitatively focused, and specifically, I would agree on income and on some type of investment balance number or retirement, focus number. But I think the point here is that it can often be quite vague, right? And one of the risks I think we run is we're making decisions based on a judgment call that we've made or determined of whether or not we're on track. That's then influencing other parts of our plan. That might be somewhat subjective. I'm thinking about something that's unique to our generation, Tim. This probably sounds a little bit like old man Tim and Tim on the Rockers, is like in the news cycle that we live in, and especially you think about just social media algorithms, like it is very much set up to put you in a position of I'm behind. I must be behind. I must not be on track. And I think sometimes that could be the depth of really what's underneath this unsettled feeling of like, maybe I'm not on track. When perhaps if we peel back the onion a little bit, like maybe we are on track if we ask some of those deeper questions.
Yeah. And then I think the flip side of that is I also get a lot, people that speak to me that there is, they make as a household, 300, 400, $500,000, and there's a lot of overconfidence there, right? And the savings rate is not consistent, or it's not great. And, we've made some mistakes behavioral wise, that aren't great. So yeah, it definitely is a spectrum. And, I think if you think about it back in the day, like baby boom generation, and even older Gen Xers, like social media wasn't a thing, right? So you didn't have everybody's best foot forward in your face all the time. And for a lot of older generations too, like pensions were the norm, right? So like even having even the thought of like tracking a large investment portfolio, I mean, that still was there, but for the most part, it was like, hey, I'm going to work for the same company for 40 years. And the pension is more or less going to take care of the majority of, along with Social Security, is going to take care of the majority of what I need, in retirement. Like that day is done, right? That doesn't exist. So yeah, there is a lot of uncertainty of like, hey, where do I fit in the universe in terms of, my ability to sustain a paycheck or whatever that is, when I'm, older and not necessarily working anymore. And even in some of the meetings where I'll say, hey, Tim, paint the picture of like what the balance sheet looks like today. So I kind of get a sense of where you're at. And I'll get a question of like, well, like, how do you, based on, you meet with a lot of pharmacists and having a lot of these meetings, like, what do you think? Like, what's your professional
What's the benchmark?
Yeah. And I'm like, well, it just really depends, right? Because like the next big thing that we typically do in our process is overlay, like, what are your goals, right?
Yeah.
So if you have $500,000 saved and, could you retire today? Maybe if your kind of burn rate is very low, but if we need 150 grand a year outside of Social Security, like that's probably not tenable. So to me, it is so much of it depends until we get, the inputs needed to really build out a comprehensive plan and be able to show you, projections and, hey, can we fund this near term goal or, this goal that's 10 years out, and how does that affect overall, the money that's in the plan? And I just think it's such a tailored thing to the individual. And I think sometimes we just get caught up because we're trying to do it in broad strokes.
I alluded to this a little bit ago as I was reflecting back on some of the early stages of measuring what I thought was on track, right? Progress with debt payoff, timeline to purchase a home. Even as I play that out a little bit further, I think about things like how much should we have saved in an emergency fund, or how are we doing with our kids' 529 accounts? And then of course, retirement accounts and other things come into play as well, which begs the question of like, does this definition of on track, does it change and evolve as we move through different seasons of life? What are your thoughts on that, and what you see with the prospective clients and the clients that you talk with that, range from, hey, our phase of life and middle of their career, maybe that debt's on the backside, they're in the midst of raising a family, maybe they're caring for elderly parents, all the way to those that are actually transitioning into retirement, which of course looks very different.
Yeah, so I kind of look at this, and this is something I've been working on, Tim, and I'll put it out into the ether. So I either, I actually do something with this content, it'll kind of force me. So like I've been kind of working on, and I don't know if I'm going to do like an on track webinar or if it's something I write, but basically it's kind of like, think of a pharmacist wealth building in really three main phases. And this is a little bit different because, for most people, it's, you have the accumulation phase and then you have the decumulation or withdrawal phase in retirement, right? Those are the two things. I think with pharmacists, it's a little bit different. I kind of think of it as like three phases, right? So phase one, kind of think of this as like escape velocity. We're really just trying to get this thing in orbit. And the primary objective here, so this is kind of typically in your late 20s, maybe even as late as like late 30s. And this is typically where the primary objective is to start making money and to stop drowning, right? Because this stage is often where there's serious loan payment. Obviously, we've talked about student loans ad nauseum, starting to kind of, seed the buckets of retirement savings. So whether that's a 401k, a 403b, a TSP, maybe even looking at IRAs, buying a first home, raising kids, maybe a little bit of career instability. And here in this phase, if we think about net worth, painfully slow progress, right?
Negative. Often.
Yeah, it starts
Yeah.
negative, but even because we're very much we're kind of swapping out, right? So we're swapping out a mortgage, a note for a house. We're
Yep.
swapping out, we're the amount of money that's going into our retirement accounts, that doesn't, you don't really start to see that exponential growth until you have more of a balance, right? So, what we're really trying to focus on here, or why we feel broke here, even though we're making a good salary, is student loans. The whole idea behind taxes of like, okay, I make this and this is actually what I get. Yeah, mortgages, daycare, and really that we haven't seen the fruits of our labor from investment really take off. So, it's the question that I think is often asked, from a pharmacist in this stage is, I make great money, but like, why does it feel like I don't? Like, why does it feel like I'm struggling?
Yes.
And we've talked about this before, Tim, is like, you don't feel your net worth, right? So even if you go from negative 300,000 to positive 300,000 in a relatively short period of time, you don't feel that. What you feel is money in and out of the bank account, right? So you might feel a little bit more of the investment, the investment portfolio, because, if you're looking at it every day, which Tim, I know you've been in that, guilty of that early in your career, it's like, you just kind of can get a little bit sidetracked. And again, the market is fickle, right? So it might have a really good, good day and you're like, okay, I made a lot of money today. And then the next day it's gone, right? Because a politician said something or, whatever it is. So that's kind of the first phase, which I kind of bolt on the front of, kind of the general public. Now, the second phase, if I can go to the next phase, is really a kind of an accumulation. And you think about this as like your 40s to early 50s. And this is where you start to see things accelerate, right? So loans are often reduced, forgiven, or eliminated. You typically start to enter your peak earnings or start to get into more of that. Again, that's a little bit different for pharmacists depending on where they're at. But then you typically start to see contributions rise, compounding becomes more visible. And then
feel it a little bit more.
Yeah,
The progress.
right.
Yeah.
And then the net worth it's nonlinear, right? So we start to see more of a curve there. And you start to see that path towards, $1 million in net worth, where you're like, okay, hey, Tim, and I've heard this often. It's like, hey, Tim, I didn't really believe you. I would kind of roll my eyes when you were talking about trajectory, but then you start to see it, right? Now you still have things like, hey, we got to pay for juniors education or things like that. Those things pop up, or maybe we're trying to travel a little bit more and take advantage of some of the life experiences,
Yeah.
while your kids are still in the house. Those obviously we need a plan for. But that's kind of the thought there. And then really you kind of get into the last phase, which is optimization, and then getting into the decumulation. So this is kind of the mid 50s and beyond. And at this point, it's, how can you kind of go from, can I build wealth to, can I start to convert this into sustainable freedom in the future? Right. So this is where we really want to make sure that, if we have good behavior and good planning in this optimization, then this is kind of the work smarter, not harder, right? So this is like, if we have great tax planning, we're on a good behavior, our investments are coordinated, we have plans for the things that pop up, because those things pop up, like, we can kind of adjust to that. Then we can kind of really make sure that as we get into the decumulation phase, we're sitting pretty. But I will say that, the underlying thing for all of these phases is that, two pharmacists, Tim, that make identical incomes, for 25, 30, 35 years can end up millions of dollars apart because of things like savings habits, lifestyle creep, taxes, just stuff happens, right? It could be a divorce. It could be, I have to, take time off to care for an aging parent, or maybe I'm resetting my career because I feel burnt out. Investment behavior, housing decisions, right? Location matters. So it's a lot harder to have, accessible cash if you live in a high cost of living area versus, somewhere that doesn't. And then again, shameless plug, simply having a plan and tracking this and asking yourself objective questions, or having an advisor ask yourselves objective questions are in terms of like, is this where we want to be, and then obviously the technical overlay of all that. So not necessarily a completely formed thought, but I think looking at that from a 3 phases, and you probably could add a 4th phase, which is just obviously how the retirement income, and how are we, looking at Social Security and, a dynamic withdrawal strategy and all that, as we begin to spend down the portfolio and the things that we have accumulated over the course of our career.
Maybe even a 5th stage of like the transfer of wealth, right?
Yeah,
And,
true.
so
Yep.
Baker Scripts, what do we call in this book?
I don't know, man. I know we jumped to a book, man. I have problems just writing. Yeah. So we'll figure something out.
Hold you on the hook for a book. But I think what's interesting about those phases, and I couldn't agree more. Just to be clear, while you made this point, those of course don't live in independent buckets, right? Where there's some accumulation that's happening in the early phase, but you described it so well in that kind of cleanup. We're trying to get our arms around the plan, just get grounded and start to play some offense instead of playing defense all the time. Like there will be some accumulation, and of course, ideally, we're starting to save towards that accumulation, but we often don't feel it, and we don't feel it in that phase because it is a grind. It's an expensive phase of life, and as you said, we haven't yet seeing the exponential growth in some of those investments. And, even as we do start to do that, someone may wake up in their early 40s and, hey, we got a $500,000, $1 million saved. But on a month-to-month cash flow basis, like it doesn't feel like I'm doing really well financially, right? And that I think is a really interesting segue to the conversation of net worth. Because as you said, the reality of what we feel month to month, year to year versus what our net worth may show, those aren't often connected in the way that we might think or hope. And since we've talked about net worth a few times, just again, quick definition, net worth is your assets, what you own minus your liabilities or what you owe. And as we've articulated many, many times on the show, that, income is a great tool that hopefully is going to allow us to grow our net worth through growing our assets, paying down our debts or liabilities over time. But net worth is a much better indicator of what sticks, of what we're actually able to translate from income into hopefully long-term building wealth. Which I think, Tim, that then brings up the question, if I'm a pharmacist hearing this, I'm thinking, well, Tim, like, where should I be with my net worth at this phase of my career? And we talk a lot about the value of net worth as a measure of financial progress. So I think a natural question is that, right? What should be my net worth now? Or what is my expected net worth? How do you think about that concept for someone who's listening that's hey, I'm 40 or I'm 50 or I'm 55?
Yeah. So, again, one of the things I'm working on, related to this, we talk about phases is that, and, specifically for like a pharmacist, right? So, you can look up like, hey, what should be, what's my net, I think Fidelity has some benchmarks out there. So, what should my net worth be in when I'm 40, when I'm 50, when I'm 60? So what I've kind of done is, you look at, you kind of start with, again, what feeds, not a financial plan, but what feeds into the net worth is you start with, a pharmacist income, right? So we can make certain assumptions about, what a pharmacist makes. And again, it could be dependent on what type of pharmacist that you are. So if you're in retail or if you're in industry, a hospital, even if you're dual income, that's going to change things. But you kind of start with that in mind, and we can kind of, estimate what a pharmacist will make over the course of their career. So you kind of start with that first, and then we kind of apply some savings rate assumptions. So if we're assuming that we're saving 15 or 20% consistently, again, maybe not at the very start, but, later, as an average over the course of your career, employer match, we're going to assume like we don't see exponential, levels of spend, with, increases in salary. So we're kind of avoiding that lifestyle creep, and we're not cashing out retirement, portfolios, which again, we've seen that, and then we're kind of overlaying those broad benchmarks. So to kind of give you an example of, a broad, benchmark is like if you're 40 years old, your expected net worth is 3 times income, right? So if I make $100,000, my expected net worth should be 300,000. Now you might be thinking like, man, I'm still working through the student debt, right? So that can obviously be a factor. That's one of the things I'm looking at too. At 50 years old, it could be 6 times income. And then at 60 years old, it's 8 times income. Those are kind of the broad general benchmarks. So what I'm developing is kind of like, through basically I'm looking at it every 5-year increments. If I'm from age 35 really to 60, and kind of using those numbers and kind of giving hey, if your net worth falls, between this range, you're on track. If you're below that range, you're behind. If you're above that range, you're kind of in a stronger position, which I think offers more flexibility. So as an example, if you are based on these kind of assumptions and metrics, if you're a 50-year-old pharmacist, the on-track expected net worth should be between $1 million and $2 million. So if you're below $1 million, I would say, statistically behind. If you're above $2 million, you're kind of in that strong position. So those are kind of the tranches. Now, again, these are just benchmarks, right? So everyone's situation is going to be different. And again, if your net worth is not tracking to that, but you think the burn rate in which you're going to go through your portfolio in retirement, then you could be very much in a strong position. So it is going to be dependent. And that's why, again, we are big proponents of talking to an advisor, put these things, get your net worth, and your balance sheet in line, overlay your goals, and then we can kind of project out, and validate those numbers or not. And if you're not, again, the beautiful thing about financial planning is that, you can do a lot of things in a very relatively short period of time that can have exponential, impact. And that's kind of the whole gist of this.
And the pharmacist in me, right? I see the expected net worth calculation, or I hear the rules of thumb, the 3 times this, the 6 times this. And, I could see myself like driving, listening to this, and I'm like pulling out my calculator, right? Trying to do the quick numbers. And then I feel like the palpitations and, am I on track? And oh my gosh, I have to save more and invest more. Or
Yeah.
Yada, yada, yada. And I think the point we're trying to make, hopefully, is that we see you and want to meet you, in that place to kind of wet your whistle, if you will, of like something to put our arms around. However, right, what is the entire focus of what we so often talk about on the show is the balance between these qualitative and the quantitative things. And I think one of the risks of some of these rules of thumb or benchmarks, are, like I need to go chase that harder, chase that faster. And there may be that may be a season for that. And that might be needed depending on the goals in your situation. But as you just said several minutes ago, take two people with the same, net worth or same income, and there could be very different needs in large part because of a burn rate when you look at something like a retirement number. So, you know, you could have someone who's got $1 million saved and they might be behind according to whatever benchmark we're using or retirement calculation. Somebody else who's got, $500,000 saved, but because their burn rate's a lot lower and looking at their expenses and their other goals, they might be just fine and they might be on track.
One of the big things here too is like a lot of people, maybe outside of their 401k, a lot of people's wealth is mostly tied up in their house. And if they're
Right.
unwilling to use that and this happens in retirement, where like, I want to stay in the house, it's really hard for us to be able to earmark that the worth in the house for anything except for it's kind of just tied up in where you live, right? So that's another thing is like you can own a $2 million house and that's going to be completely paid off, but maybe that's half your net worth. Like that's hard to
Right.
if there's no flexibility there with that asset, it's hard to use that for anything except for like, hey, we're just going to earmark that for living.
Yeah.
So it can be
Which
very
really gets
different.
to asset location, right? And
Right.
we don't need to nerd out on this too much, but that's really what you're talking about in terms of, let's say you have $2 million saved and I have $2 million saved, but half of mine is in my home equity. And then maybe I've got a second million that's in a traditional IRA, but you've got $2 million that maybe, almost all of that sitting in a brokerage account, for example. I mean, those are two very different situations, right?
Yeah.
Of, so again, it's a helpful tool. And I think it's one that there's value in measuring, am I progressing in the right direction? But the asterisk is really important to note. And I think speaks to the value of really getting into the individual aspects of somebody's situation and planning, and not just applying general rules of thumb, to the whole financial plan. What do you think, Tim, about the unique aspects of Pharmacists with these benchmarks for expected net worth? So what I'm thinking about are things like, hey, yes, I maybe have above average income, but there's a delayed start to earnings, right? Because of a longer educational pathway. Therefore, there's a delayed start to savings and compounding, although you could argue that's maybe offset by higher contribution rates. So it'll catch up and exceed it over time. And there's higher than average debt loads, right? So wouldn't we expect that if someone is looking at a general rule of thumb net worth calculation and they're doing that number early in their career, that they might be behind because of those factors? Hey, I got a delayed start to saving, I haven't had time for those to compound, and I have more debt. Therefore, my liabilities column is going to be bigger. And then at some point that maybe crosses and exceed. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think that, the kind of the model in which I'm working on, it does indirectly account for kind of a late start and negative net worth, right? So it kind of assumes a longer than expected delayed, ability to accumulate wealth,
Right.
due to the substantial debt and slower early compounding, right? And that's one of the things where, when you would read about this before, it's like, well, a lot of people aren't coming out with 6 figures worth of debt. So how does that affect us? So, but there are, again, like with one of the things with debt is you start, negative, but because you have to pay off the loans or because of things like forgiveness, you can see progress on your net worth. Like I said, like we've seen I mentioned, the negative 300,000, the positive 300,000 in a very short period of time. And you can also have with forgiveness a cliff where it's like all of a sudden I'm negative 200,000 from
Yep.
a net worth perspective, and that goes away overnight, right? So, but not everyone has that, right? So it does account for that. I think that the, you know, the one thing that people need to realize is like, yeah, when you graduate and you have the average amount of net worth, that is the kind of the price you pay to start your career at a 6-figure salary. Not everyone's created equal, right? So there's still, 10%, right? So you might listen to that and be like, shut up, Tim. And I get it. But the, you know, the thought is that over the course of a 30, 40-year career, that that income and the ability to defer income into retirement, can still even outpace the general public, right? Most people, when when they reach 50, their expected net worth is not $1 million, right? And we know that because of 401k studies and just what the average American has. So and it's hard to see, right? So like if you're in that space right now and you're like, yeah, right, Tim, like believe me, I get that a lot, or it's just like, yeah, that sounds great, but that's not going to be me, or I'm never going to be able to retire. And I promise you, again, with a little bit of planning, a little bit of intentionality, we'll get there, right? And this is a slow and steady type of thing, but like once you get to a certain point, you start to see this, you kind of experience this inflection point and you'll start to see more of the exponential. So it is more so delayed than, I think, a different maybe path, but I'd also argue that, where you start out from an income perspective is different as well. So, and I think if you can create positive, good behavior, as when you approach the debt and then overlay that to, the invested in savings rate, again, that I think that bodes well for the longevity of the financial plan.
Yeah, and to your point, if people are aggressively paying down debt and they're saving, you're hitting both sides of the equation, right? So you'll see the net worth, typically progress pretty early on, and then hopefully over time we see the exponential growth. I'm thinking of the people listening, Tim, that maybe are hearing some of these benchmarks and they're thinking, well, according to that, I'm on track, but it doesn't feel like that, right? I still feel like I'm behind. And what's coming up for me is I can vividly remember a place where Jess and I were at after working through the $200,000 of debt. This probably would have been like early-ish 30s to mid 30s. Debt's gone. Like, hey, we've got through that grind. Bought a home, growing family, and having this nagging feeling of like, yeah, the retirement calculations are checking out good. The net worth calculations are checking out good. But man, it does not feel like it, right? Month to month, year to year. And just curious to hear more of your thoughts on that and what you see from clients and prospective clients, because I think that's a very common thing where people are in this middle part of their career-ish and, hey, maybe net worth is on track. Maybe the retirement numbers are checking out as we do the nest egg calculations, but gosh, it just feels like we're not there.
Yeah. So I think if we talk about that kind of escape velocity, phase, the feeling of scarcity is not something that you're like, things are tight, right? And I think right now, especially given the economic environment where everything is more expensive, gas, food, rent, buying a house, everything is expensive, right? You feel that in your day to day. I think that, as you proceed though, so there's context to this, right? So like if you are saving, and I recently had a conversation with a client about this, like if you're saving, 15, 20, 25% towards retirement or education, you're kind of creating, like, you don't do that right out of the gate typically, but you're kind of creating a feeling of scarcity, which I would argue in a lot of ways is a good thing, right? And I will say, like, if I see just money laying in my account, I'm trying to come up with creative things to do with it that have that don't help me at all, right?
Yeah,
So
versus creating I talk about this as a healthy friction. Like there's a healthy
yes,
friction.
right.
Yep.
Now that could be exhausting, right? So like even if you're doing a zero-based budget for years and you're accounting for every dollar that comes in, that is tiresome
Grind.
and typically not
Yeah.
sustainable over the long period. So I think for sprints, those are actually, it's a good exercise. It's the same thing. Like if you are feeling that, I think we can probably use this example, Tim, going back, into the memory vault with you guys. I think because of your situation with loans, which you documented coming out of pharmacy school, I think you and Jess were very much sensitive to that, and were attacking the boys' education accounts like very early on. And I was just like, why? Like, give me some context behind that.
Yeah.
And I think we kind of came to the conclusion of like, hey, maybe we can, you guys had done a lot, even, in the point of your career at that time. But I think even like lifting the pedal, the foot off the pedal for that freed up some additional cash flow to do things that were maybe in the here and now, right? And that's what
Yep.
we go back to. How can we live a wealthy life today and a wealthy life tomorrow? So, and I had a conversation with a client recently where they're like, oh, like we feel like, we're starting to see some creep with credit card bills and things like that, not because of lifestyle creep, but that could be part of it when we break down the data, which again, we have to, rein in and control. But also, if their savings rate is high, there's maybe a ability for us to pull back, based on the projections to say, okay, maybe we don't need to max out right now. We can, because this is happening, we can pull back on this and free up cash flow for here and now. Like that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think it's like one of those, I think it's almost like related to like the iceberg, right? So you see an iceberg sticking out of the water, but like 80% of that, like the ice is underneath and you can't see it. I think so is true with your financial plan. Like, if you have a emergency fund, or if you're well funded for vacations, or you're well funded for kids activities, you're maybe you're maxing out your 401k and you have a good base, or you're getting the state tax deduction or whatever for your 529s, the HSAs are being funded. These are all building blocks and things that kind of fly beneath the surface. At the end of the day, what you're feeling in terms of the pinch is, oh, like, can't wait to get paid again because, I need that influx of cash because, groceries and things like that. So but if you don't have that savings rate and you don't have that emergency fund, and we're paying for trips on credit card and things like that, that's where it's like, okay, we got to start. That's lifestyle creep, right? And we got to start. And it's a two-sided equation. We either got to make more money or we got to cut expenses. And the cutting expenses can be painful, but if you have a little bit of that buffer where you're doing all those things, then it can free up some cash flow for the here and now to take advantage of the time that whatever phase of life that you're in. And I think that optionality and flexibility is really important. So if we talk about like we talked about like the different phases, Tim, like, or no, the different tranches, like, am I behind? Am I on track? Yep. Am I in a strong position? And this is kind of something that I want to look at too, is like often those are categorized by flexibility, right? So like the strong position is one where I have the ability to work or not, maybe retire early, maybe it's charitable capacity, just lower financial anxiety. If you're on track, it's kind of more of the here, kind of maintain the here and now. Like I'm retiring at a typical age, or early to mid 60s. I can maintain my lifestyle. I have some moderate flexibility. If you're behind, you're under saving, maybe you're late to the game, it's lifestyle inflation or lifestyle creep, poor investment behavior, or just poor financial behavior, and then no coordinated strategy. So we're trying to move up the ladder, right? To get to where we have some moderate flexibility to where, hey, we can essentially do what we want. So again, the financial plan is kind of the backbone of all this, to be able to assess and not just kind of, throw our finger in the air and be like, okay, I think I'm on track, or I'm not.
That's it right there. That's what I think is going on here. Whether you look at, when you said 529, and Jess and I, it triggered the memory of like, when you asked the question, well, what's the point? What's the purpose? What are we doing here? Right. It was one of many examples where we were trying to check a box because that's what you should do. Right. You should.
Yeah. Well, there's trauma there, right? Like you're
totally
here today. One of the reasons you're here today with me, talking about this, is because of what you experienced and like the lack of understanding of that. But that baggage you still carried until I think you were asked a an open-ended question of why are we doing that? And you're not wrong. You could have came back at me and be like, hey, this is really important. I don't want my sons to deal with that. Like I want to get them to where they are even Steven when they come out of college. And that's fine too, right? But we have to build a plan around that. So
There's always another box to check, right? It could
yes,
be maxing out a 401k,
right.
maxing out an IRA, maxing out an HSA, getting to the state tax deduction on a fine. There's always a bar to achieve. And I'm thinking about two different situations that are listening. One of is that I'm the excessive box checker, and maybe I'm, always striving for that extra savings, that extra account. And even when we get through maxing out all those accounts, well, shouldn't we have some in non-retirement accounts, and there's more work to be done there, and shouldn't we diversify into other areas, right? So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, maybe I'm not saving enough for retirement. I'm the lifestyle creep, expenses, whatever is going on, I'm technically behind, and we do need to do a little bit more. In both of those situations, though, the common thread, I believe, is lack of clarity and lack of a plan. Right? If we can develop a plan that is a North Star of where do we need to be going, where do we want to go, why do we want to be going there, and then to bring the plan around it quantitatively and qualitatively to support it, to answer some of the questions that need to be answered, it helps us course correct, if you will, to actually put some meat on the bone to what does on track mean, not just externally. What does on track mean to me, to us, to our financial plan, our situation, our burn rate, our expenses, right? Our family, our household. And then let's develop the plan and execute on that plan over a long period of time. I think that's where so much of the unsettledness comes from of, hey, are we on track? Are we not on track? And we're making decisions based off of whether we think or we are or we aren't. Like we're missing a plan, or we're missing some of the clarity to help answer that question, which is an answerable question.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, one of the things that pops into my head, it kind of goes back to like our script or plan meeting, which is really like the goal setting. Hey, where are we going? One of the exercises we do is we ask the question of, what does success look like, a year out? So I kind of joke like, let's get into the DeLorean, go 88 miles per hour, and we go to May of 2027. We get out, what's success like? 3 years. 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. The further we go out, the more disconnected we are to like, today, right? So if I imagine like your 30-year-old self, most people are like, they can do a year, 3 years, maybe even 5 years, but their 30-year-old self, it's like, so I'm like, okay, what's your parents right now? Like put yourself in your parents' shoes. And that's a little bit easy for us to do because you're like, okay, my dad, my mom's doing it. Yeah, they can see it. And there's also, this is kind of a tangential, but I actually heard this term. I was at a conference recently, and this is another thing I have some content on. Have you heard of like the end of history? It's a cognitive bias.
No.
So thought
I
experiment.
feel like I might have it though, without even knowing what it is. Based
You
on the
do.
term.
So if we talk about I didn't know what this was, and like I finally, I'm like, okay, that's what it is. So if we think about, if I say, hey, Tim, reflect back on the last 5 years, and kind of the evolution of you and your family. So 5 years ago was what, 2021. So we're right in the heart of the pandemic. You think about your boys, you and Jess, were the businesses. We could probably come to the conclusion that like a lot has changed, right?
Absolutely.
But
even in 1 year, 3 years. Yeah.
But then I'm like, okay, like, let's talk about the next 5 years to 2031.
Assume that it's going to look like it does today.
Exactly. So like, there's this cognitive bias that we're like, hey, I got it from here, or nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
And it's completely untrue. It's like our brain cannot see down the path of like what's around the corner. And you just assume that like, hey, my likes and my taste and the trajectory is going to remain very consistent to like where it is today.
My health will be the same.
Correct.
And all will
right.
be, yeah. Yeah.
So I think that, I was like, I need to talk about this because I see this all the time. I just didn't know what it was. But I think like that thought experiment of going out, and kind of project is really, really important. And to review that, time and time and again to see how different things are, right? So, You know,
What you're saying there, Tim, is if we can look back and appreciate that change has happened, then it will help us be able to accept, and therefore we should assume that change will happen going forward because it has happened
right.
going backwards. So you got to fight against that bias.
Yeah, and our brain is just wired to think like,
Yeah.
okay, like kind of like I have arrived, like I've made it, and like this is gonna be who I am and my situation. For I know with for me, I think the kind of the great equalizer are my kids, right? So like I see like it's almost like you can see the change in them, and I know in 5 years, my youngest Zoe, she's gonna be 7, not 2, so I can see that growth and how our family dynamics gonna change. But from a career perspective, from a relationship perspective, you just think like, hey, it's going to be status quo. So
Doesn't this explain in part some of the reservation or maybe challenges with things like long-term disability or term
yeah,
life insurance? Like,
yeah,
right, we think that, hey, I'm healthy now, like I'm going to be healthy in 5 years, or those situations aren't likely to happen, and statistically they're not, right? But it's hard to really predict ourselves or visualize ourselves in a scenario other than where we're at today.
yeah. And those are the things that we mentioned, like, hey, you could have a pharmacist that is, a 2 million net worth versus one that has 1 million net worth. But what's lurking around the corner for the 2 million net worth, because they haven't done the estate or the risk assessment in terms of insurance policies, where maybe the one with $1 million has, again, we don't know what's going to happen, but that client or that pharmacist that is their foundation is on rockier ground. These things happen, right? Like, so, I met a planner at this conference that, they're based in New Orleans, and a lot of her clients have been affected by hurricanes and things like that. Those are catastrophic losses. And sometimes they're covered by insurance and sometimes they're not. And I'm like, what do? You kind of just start over, or you move, which a lot of people there have. And, because of the, just the weather. So, those things are lurking too, which is again why we try to say build a good foundation. And it's, from an insurance perspective, from a estate plan perspective, it's important to have that, because you're trying to, we talk about, building a moat, right, around the business and things like that. You have to build a moat around your financial plan, because,
Yeah.
these plans and these statistics, happen for a reason, but you always think it's going to be someone else until it's not, right? So, even something like a divorce, Tim, like that plays, a major, it's a major bump in the road in terms of the trajectory of wealth and things like that. It can be very expensive. So if, those are things that, we have to account for and adjust. And that's often one of the reasons why people will reach out to me as well. It's like, hey, I just got through a divorce. I need to kind of reset, catch my bearings. And I think one of the things that is often comes out of those types of clients is just like the idea of like, okay, what do I want from here financially, but just even beyond that. So, yeah, I definitely think that to measure time, hey, what does success look like a year out, 3 years out? And I pose that question, what does success look like? Because oftentimes it's funny, because we started the episode talking about like expected net worth or retirement portfolio. Never is that answer like, I want $1 million in my 401k. It's like, it's more of the qualitative things of like, I want to make sure I want to take this trip that I've been putting off forever. I want to make sure that, my kids are active, I'm healthy, whatever those
Flexibility
things.
of time.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Charitable things. It's a
Yeah.
lot less of the checking the box in terms of like the financial numbers, or like, hey, I want to make this amount of money. And it's more of the qualitative things, which again, I think is the true value. All the technical stuff we're going to get right. We're going to keep you from making catastrophic mistakes. We're going to make sure that the taxes are efficient. We're going to make sure that the portfolio is kind of rowing in the same direction.
Yep.
We're going to push savings rate when appropriate. Those things we're going to get right. Not a guarantee, right? But can't say that. But we're going to make sure that we're technically sound. It's the qualitative stuff that we can layer on top of and be really, really intentional with, which I think is the difference between having a financial plan and not. It's not the quantitative thing, in my opinion.
Tim, great stuff as always. And I think my challenge for those listening, really a challenge for, myself and for us collectively is, how often we ask ourselves this question, or maybe find ourselves feeling in a point of comparison or question, like, am I on track? And, sometimes there can be a scarcity feeling that comes up through that. Maybe there's feelings of guilt or fear or other things that are present. And as we described, the missing piece of this is potentially a plan and clarity of where are we going and why are we going there? And as you said, how do we develop a plan that addresses both the quantitative and the qualitative? And so if you find yourself asking this question, am I on track? And not really quite sure whether or not you are, or what that is based off of, might the missing plan be a piece that could be implemented, and what potential impact would that have as you look at the long term of this, both quantitatively and qualitatively? So Tim, great stuff. And we'll be back at it here in a couple weeks.
Guess I got to start right in there, Tim.
Let's do it. Baker Scripts. Here we go. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scripted Wealth, Money and Meaning for Pharmacists. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share the show with a friend or colleague. It really helps more pharmacists discover the show and join us on the journey toward living a rich life today and tomorrow. And if today's episode got you thinking about your own financial plan, retirement goals, or what a rich life means for you, we'd love to help. You can learn more about our fee-only comprehensive financial planning services by visiting yfbwealth.com. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information of the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information, you can visit yfbwealth.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.